Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to this first Leaders in Tech meetup. I'm very happy that Francois created this forum. I had wanted something like that for a while, like he said, and yeah, it's very unfortunate that we are remote, but we'll try to deal with it. A few things. During this presentation, I won't see you because I'm looking at my slides and my text in full screen. If my connection drops, which unfortunately is likely, Francois will notify me with WhatsApp. If you freeze on your side or miss something, I'm trying to record my slide and my voice, so if all works well, I'll be able to give you the video. And after the talk, we can try and go back to GatherTown and do small groups to discuss. That's what the tool is for, so we can try that. Okay, so now for the subject of building an autonomous team. And my pointer does not work. If I need to, okay, it does. So I'm Greg. Little story about me to start with. I'm a software engineer by training. I started my career in a big corporation where I was, as we say, climbing the ladder. As I grew after a few years, I started to become disillusioned with politics and the value I was bringing, or maybe the absence of value I was bringing. So I decided to move and I joined a consulting company where I met a few of you. It broadened widely my horizons and it allowed me to see many different organizations, but it left me with an awkward feeling that I was selling a lot of theory, but not seeing a lot of it in practice. Because those things I believed in, as we'll see today, they require time, energy, and leadership. And a consultant report, it can only ever be the start. And I did not get the opportunity to work on long missions of accompanying a team. So I then joined a different company and I had the opportunity to create a brand new team and to do a brand new product in the cloud. And I was lucky because I was given free reins. And so I could really put in practice what I had been selling and confront my beliefs to the actual reality. And I think I did build a successful team and a successful environment conducive of further success. So where do my beliefs come from? What will I base this presentation on? So as I just mentioned, it comes first from my experience, but second, it also comes from my professional network with which I engage regularly. And again, some of you are in this network. And finally, it comes from my readings. So I read a lot on many topics: management, organization, corporate cultures. I'll mention a lot of books today, and that's a lot of inspiration for me. So before I finish this intro, 2 disclaimers. My comments, they are going to be tinted by IT. I think all of you or most of you are IT. I work in IT and that's why, but I think most of what I say apply more broadly and I will try to stay generic. And the second disclaimer is that I'll use leader and manager interchangeably in today's talk, but they are not quite the same thing. But for the purpose of this talk today, I'll make the mix. I'll mix them together. Okay, so let's start with why we talk about autonomy. As a leader, you should be interested in your team's productivity. And I mean productivity not measured by some skewed metric, but really as in how much value to the company can my team deliver. And so it's not the purpose of today to discuss about how to measure this thing. I'll leave that for another time. But in today's world, which is fast, very competitive, and ever-changing, most of the work is about creativity and problem solving. And it's not about performing recurring tasks. And therefore, being a taskmaster, which is kind of the default management model, or maybe old school, or I don't know, this is not an optimal solution. And this is supported by research, and I'll come to that in this presentation. So you want productivity, but you have a big problem. I'm sure you've heard this stat. Less than a third of employees are engaged at work. And I don't think it's necessary to prove to you that employees not engaged are not productive. So you have that, but on the other end, you hear plenty of success stories. For example, Zappos, which gave all power to its employees through Holacracy and achieved great results. And there are many, many more. So you might say that this is only IT startups from the Silicon Valley with highly educated engineers. But so in his book, How Do We Do Anything Means Everything, Dov Seidman mentions a lot of examples, and some of them are interesting, and take them here. So there is first the GE Durham plant that produces jet engines, big engineering facility. And it is fully managed by its engineers. And by that, I mean that the engineers, they rotate in the administrative, HR, strategy, whatever tasks need to be done, on top of obviously doing their engineering work. And this facility is outperforming significantly the other manufacturing sites of the company. Okay, so you might say that although it's not a startup, this is still a very highly educated group of people. But there are other examples. So he talks about the Sewell car dealership. And he says that it's more productive and it has less churn than other dealerships. And that's due to an engaged workforce all the way down to the cleaning staff. And when I say less churn, it's really impressive. So they have a churn of 22% in an industry where the average is 184%. This is a crazy number for me. And he talks about more, I could not find a reference anymore, but there is a story of a farmers cooperative in Latin America where each participant, they set their own salary. And so you might have realized that there is a common theme here which transpires, and it's about the fact that these environments, they are built around autonomy. In the Sewell example, the car dealership, the anecdote is striking. They have created such a culture that if the phone rings outside of business hours, where only the cleaning crew is there, the cleaning crew will pick up the phone and handle the contact and log in the CRM and do whatever. I mean, that feels crazy to me. So at this point, I feel obliged to take some time to make a remark. This explosion of autonomy, of empowerment, it's not just about having found a better way to work. It's not that past thought leaders, they had it completely wrong and that we are much smarter than they are, right? What it does is that it reflects a changing world. The average education levels in the workplace, they are higher. The jobs that we do are, and the jobs of the creative kind are more abundant. And a lot of things are getting commoditized, which change completely the way we make decisions about them. And this is something that took me long to realize in my experience and that I tend to forget when I talk about such topics. And the thing is, we have new ways of organizing because the world of today is very different from 15 years ago. And I said 15, and that's basically yesterday. I mean, I started 15 years ago, and the world I entered and the world today, they are very, very, very different. So if we take an example in the software world, 3 weeks ago, Jeff Lawson, the CEO of Twilio, he released a book titled Ask Your Developers. It's not strictly about IT, it's about company strategy and culture and organization and all those things. And one thing he says that stayed with me is that before the cloud era, which we have been in only for 10, 15 years, right? It made sense that IT decisions were made top down because they were about decade-long investments costing millions of dollars, right? Your IBM mainframe. And so, of course, you had to do through this complicated process to get anything done. Nowadays, however, with the web, the cloud, APIs, microservices, it makes more sense for the developer, who are the closest to the need, to make the design decisions. They don't have long-term or sizable financial impact anymore. And so those new capabilities, they mean that the organization can be different and that, well, it should if it's better in the end. Okay, so we want more autonomy in our organization. So let's just quickly say what's autonomy. So this picture here, you have to get that out of your head. You might have heard about the 10x developer or the 1000x developer, whatever. As far as I'm concerned, this is not that guy. In the picture, you have a crack developer that is very good at coding, at developing complex algorithms, at circumventing tricky security, entering the matrix, whatever. And those skills, they are not predictors of productivity in a team environment inside a business. In the majority of companies, the difficulties, they are of the kind of human interaction and processes and strategy and things like that. They are not about hardcore skills. So let me illustrate that with sport. So I was at a volleyball match once when I was a student. So the guy who is jumping in the picture is at a position that's called the pipe. It is hard to play, but it's very important because such an attacker strikes very far away from the net, and so he can avoid the block. And in this particular match, one of the team, they had an international level player that was playing this position. The rest of the team, it was not at the same level. And it was striking. If the team was able to get him the ball exactly right, he would score every single time. That was amazing. But most of the time, the ball would not come right. And that would frustrate him, and it would make him commit mistakes, and that would frustrate the others, and some kind of vicious circle would happen. But on the other side of the net, the other team, they did not have a superstar, but they had a much more cohesive and communicative team. And they ended up making a more productive whole. And so my point is that the superstar is not the highly skilled lone wolf. It's the team. It's the individuals in the team that are skilled, but that can interact with each other and make the team move forward. And I'm sure you understand easily the sport example. And, well, it's exactly the same thing in your organization. So it's all about the group or the team. It's the fact that the team is focused in a single direction, that the humans' interactions, they are lean, that the individuals feel empowered. An autonomous team works towards a shared goal. The team and the individuals, they get the job done and they make decisions. They have power in how the problem they are responsible for gets solved. And that's what I try to talk about for the rest of this presentation. So the late Tony CA from Zappos, he was a precursor in holacracy. He built a company with zero hierarchy, absolutely zero. And there is a funny anecdote in a holacracy is that the process starts with the CEO writing a formal letters to all the employees where he abdicates all his decision power. And you don't need his approval or even his opinion for anything, except the few things that have been agreed are owned by him. And that's the same model for any employee. But there is something important there. Holacracy is a framework that completely empowers the employee. But you have to be careful. It's not hierarchy. No hierarchy does not mean no organization. And holacracy is actually a very structured framework. It's not about saying you're autonomous now, just work. You have to accompany it. You have to give it an environment in which to grow. So just as a side note, I'm not convinced by the full-fledged holacracy, but there are some extremely interesting ideas about managing roles and responsibilities in an orthogonal way from job and people, and I would advise you to read about that. But back to teams and autonomy. So now that we have a bit of a better grasp on what I'm talking about and what's autonomy, let me talk about sure signs of the lack of autonomy. So the first anecdote happened a few years ago. I was building a cloud product for the company that was based on an application that another team in the company was producing and also selling to the outside, to the public. And so one day I'm in copy of a mail that says that to support new features, they are upgrading dependencies, which means that the software is not going to work on Ubuntu 14 anymore and that it'll need Ubuntu 16. And I'm super happy with that because as an internal client of this software, being forced to work on the old version of the OS, that was really a pain. But something bothered me. So I answered to this person to check. I told him, you're building, packaging, and distributing the software for Ubuntu 14. And there has been a project to upgrade, but has been delayed, and I don't think it's completed. I have not heard any change about that. So if the features are not working on Ubuntu 14, does that mean that, the packaging did move to Ubuntu 16 too? Is it all consistent? And the answer was, I don't know. I just did what I was told. And so the person on top of that did not do any follow-up. He just did not care. He could not be bothered. So there are many problems in this story, many reasons for this behavior, but it's a telling example. But I'll take a simpler one so that you can really see what I'm talking about. So a few years ago still, I read a book. I think it Does Not Have to Be Crazy at Work by the guys from Basecamp, but I'm not sure. And in this book, I thought there were some really interesting advices and concepts that my CEO should get inspiration from. So I sent him a mail to talk about the book. He responded that I should have the company buy it. There was a small library in the company who were buying some books, so okay. So I forwarded the communication to the office manager who was in charge of buying the books. I gave her the Amazon link, and I mentioned that it was a request from the CEO, as shown in the mail thread. And she answered, that I needed the approval from my manager. Yeah, so I insist, right? I mention again, well, this is coming from the CEO, right? It's in the mail. She did not budge. So yeah, I'm pissed off at that point, obviously. And I mean, you're going crazy, right? This person is so stupid and unhelpful. But, and that's where it's important, it's wrong to blame the individual. And by the way, I had a good contact with her. And the problem is that she feels in her environment that she can't make an exception to the rule. And I'm sure she knows that she was asking something stupid, right? She was asking for my manager's approval and I had the CEO's approval. But she saw no way around the process. And I mean, knowing the structure in which she was evolving, I kind of understand that. If I take the step back, right? So you can find similar example in several books. So both the Phoenix Project and the 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, they are written as novels. In each of those books, the protagonist is a leader. And he has to work with people that really seem stupid, ill-intentioned, not team players. It's awful. The environment is awful to start with. And what's interesting in both those books is that while the protagonist changes the environment, those same people, they start to behave differently. And by the end of the book, they feel very much like nice teammates. And of course, this is fiction, but this resonates very much with me and it conforms to my experience. And it's the basis of Management 3.0, and I'll mention that at the end of the presentation. So those kind of behaviors, which you could qualify as hiding behind your job description, hiding behind the processes, hiding behind your managers, they are signs that the system is not empowering the employees and giving them autonomy. And what's unlucky for us is that this is this more defensive and passive behavior, it tends to be the human default. So if we want something different, we have to work for it. Okay, so with the shared understanding of what's a good target, what is your role as a leader, and what are your tools? What can you do? Okay, so first I'm going to start with a bit of context about your company and your personal mindset. So your organization is not the same as the one in the next office. It is not the same as the one in this book you read. And it's great to read books and accumulate stories and advices, but you also have to learn to read your environment. So for example, we'll talk about failure afterwards. And obviously, you cannot do this kind of thing in the same conditions as Facebook, which has a social network app, at Skyguide, which has a control tower software, and at Medtronic, where they are programming robots that will do surgery on humans. What you can do vary with the business you're in. Things like ethics, regulations, danger, the size of the company, the values the company defends, all of those things, they are different. They create a different ecosystem. And the point is, there is no one-size-fits-all solution, right? And it's important. The second piece of context that is very important for you to understand is that people are not ready. You can't go tomorrow in the office and tell your team, you're autonomous, please go on with your day. Junior people, they lack maturity for that. Organization, autonomy, all those skills, it's something that you acquire and you need experience and maturity. But more importantly, even senior people, they have rarely been put in situations of large autonomy in the past. And therefore, they might not have more experience on this front than your more junior people. It sometimes feels they have even less because they have gotten used to a certain structure and hierarchy, whatever you want to call it. Right? So that's important context. And maybe the idea that people are not ready, it might not be easy to accept for you. That's likely not your personal experience. You're autonomous in your work, and that has been the case for a while, right? And the thing is there that you're biased. Most likely, you have experience and skills that others do not have. And that is why you're occupying a leader position today. And maybe you just figure it out on your own. Maybe you have some predispositions with the skills needed for this kind of autonomous behavior. But now your survivor bias tells you that anybody can do it, that it's easy, and more dangerously, that it does not need to be managed. But it does. And if you act like everybody will figure it out, you'll start to realize that it does not work. And then you fall into the trap of going the other extremity. I'm sure you have felt this too. You can't afford not to tell people what to do. It would not work. They don't understand enough. They are too junior. And it's not only a feeling. You have had this experience in the field. I know I have. But it's a wrong perspective. You are where you are in a leadership position because you were good at your job. So it's likely that you can do your teammates' job better than they can, at least today, or at least when you are close to your promotion. Okay. But you also need to realize that it's not the point. In your leadership position, what you want is to scale. And you don't want the team to produce as much as you would. You want each member of the team to produce as much as you would, maybe even more, because you are going to bring them a better environment than the one you were evolving in. And this is possible. Okay, so what are the tools and what can you do as a leader? Is there a carrot? Well, the carrot, it does not work. At the very least, not the typical carrot, which is money. There are studies, academic studies, that show that above $75,000 a year, the increase in salary does not impact happiness. And so a salary increase or a bonus is not calling for extra efforts. And that's not saying you should not pay your employees, but you won't motivate them much with incremental amounts of money. And I completely relate to that. But it's even worse than that. Many studies have been done on incentives. And so what they have found is that when you give an outcome-based incentive to people that have to perform some manual labor, like bolting a door to a car frame, the more you give, the more you get, within reasonable limits of what human can do. But what's interesting is that if you give a creative task, the more incentive you give, the less output you get. And it's not in ratio, it's in absolute. In experiments, unpaid people, they actually outperform paid ones. And it has been found it's because when you have an incentive, you start to introduce stress in the mix and other factors, and they are the enemy of creativity. And that's striking. You don't pay people, they do better than if you pay them. Means you incentivize them with money. It's slightly different. Okay, so the carrot does not work. What about the stick? Doesn't work either. So the employment market for creative workers, engineers in general, IT people in particular, it's booming. You can't frighten me because I don't care if I lose my job. And I'm being very literal here. And I won't even talk about the fact that what's your productivity in an environment where workers are ruled by fear? Let's not talk about that. Okay, so if not the carrot, not the stick, what? And well, that starts by fully trusting your team. And I know it's hard, and trust needs to be earned, and so on and so forth. But I have a question. What is the alternative to you trusting your team? So we said that your goal as a leader is to scale your impact. And you cannot do that if you control every single detail. And you can't let go of control without trust. So you have no way around trust. The good news is that if you let them, most people will work to the best of their capacity. And that's what happened in all those examples that I mentioned. People who are engaged, who feel they bring values, who do not feel shackled and controlled every step of the way, they have no reason to slack off, and they will use their hour at work in a productive way. And this is something I strongly believe in. And it's actually a necessity for me. If I did not believe in that, I would not be a leader. I have heard on the side of being a taskmaster in the past, and it's not something I want to ever do again. So, to create a team that works autonomously, there needs to be a high level of trust within and without the team. If you are convinced that you want your team members to be autonomous, you kind of have to leave them alone. And you can't do that without trusting them. Without trust, you'll always come back to controls, checks, unnecessary heavy processes, all those things that slow progress. When a new person joins my team, I start with a position of trust. It can be broken, sure, but it should not have to be earned to start with. You start with trust. Then, if there is cause for mistrust, you don't create processes that hinder everybody. You deal with the individual case. You are not the army. The army, they seek obedience and conformity. You are a dynamic and competitive corporation that seeks creativity and diversity, right? The army puts processes in place for conformity and to get the smallest common denominator. And it works great for them, for their particular purpose. But you want the exact opposite, right? And building for an autonomous team also means letting people go. Okay, I had to do that for the first time a few years ago. We hired someone that had basically really rocked our interview process. She was a junior. She was a nice person. Everybody wanted her in the team. But when she joined, it just did not work. Many reasons for that, and we worked on them, but it was not a good fit. So we just can't claim about it because it was hard on both sides, and we decided that it was best to stop, that she needed a different environment. And that's also one of your responsibility as a leader. And it's hard and it feels bad, but first, to be blunt, it's not your problem. You have a responsibility to your company first and foremost, not to the employee. Second, in the current job market, there are no issues for someone to find a job, so you are not, ending them some kind of life-threatening news or something like that. And also, if the person is not a good fit, it's very likely the person is suffering too, not only the team and the company. And so this kind of decision is very important, and it's very important for you, for the team, for the person, but also for the entire team, because an autonomous team runs on engagement and morale and shared goals, and you can't afford to have someone that does not fit. And there are some compelling arguments about this in No Rules. I mentioned this book again later. Anyway, back to the topic of trust and teams. So there is a famous quote from Steve Jobs that you have heard 1,000 times. It doesn't make sense to hire smart people and tell them what to do. We hire smart people so that they can tell us what to do. So how does that manifest itself? So in Ask Your Developer that I mentioned earlier, and in Shape Up from Basecamp, you find this idea that engineers strive on solving problems. Yet in most organizations, engineers are given solutions that they are asked to execute. So first, like we saw with the Steve Jobs quotes, that's a lot of wasted value. Engineers, they are the best people to make the hard decisions. They are in the trenches, they have the deeper and wider technical knowledge. And therefore, with nowadays tools, as I mentioned, decisions should rarely come from the top. But also, and as importantly, if most engineers strive on solving problems, they despise executing other people's ideas. Even more so if they don't believe in them. And you will certainly not get a good result in those conditions. It's actually a very telling behavior, and I've noticed it in myself. A good engineer, not engaged at work, will often find side activities to challenge him. That's just a waste for the employer, sorry. So that's the first big thing about you being a leader. As a leader, you want to organize your environment in a way that your engineers get to solve problems and contribute to the entire value-added process, not just the end of it. You want to empower them. And this empowerment does not exist without trust I was mentioning before. Empowering means that involving people early in the process. It means not shielding them from customer or sales or support or whatever. It is actually a very common practice to say that the support engineer or the sales rep or the product owner or the scrum master, they are there to protect the team so they can focus. And the what? Like barf code all day long? That's focusing on the wrong problem. That's when you think your engineers, they are just there to execute a predefined solution. But that's not what you want. That's not what they should do. You want them to find a good solution to a problem. As a software engineer, I spend more time thinking about problems, gathering context, seeking feedback, than actually writing code. And so this shielding thing is not a good thing. So I worked at a small company. There were about 20 developers and R&D people in a team, and there were 5 customer support people that were for the product that this team was developing. And there was in this team a product owner as a shield kind of person. And what it meant is that engineers had no idea what was happening in production and could not decide to take action. And before you say that it's the role of the PO, I will answer that the PO is a single person and is not perfect. But more importantly, the PO often lacks the cost side of the equation. He does not know how much solving a problem will cost, so he can't prioritize it in a vacuum. Plus, knowing about problems or feature requests, wishes, things like that, even those that you choose not to fix or to implement, it might still inform architectural design decisions you are making daily so that you leave the door open for the future. And so it's important that this information flows around. And so I repeat myself again. You start with implicit trust, and thanks to that, you empower your team. Okay. So you trust your team, you want to empower them, and you have started removing the barriers. Now you need to let them act. The thing is that it's all about experience, and you increase your experience by doing things. The people that are successful, the ones who get promoted, and I'm guessing I'm talking to them, they actually got there not because they were doing exactly what they were told, what was in their task and what was in their job description. You don't get a career path anymore if you ever got one in the past. Rather, the people that get to be the top are those that go the extra mile. They are those that get outside their comfort zone. And in doing so, they acquire new skills. They learn to deal with the unknown, and they deal with the particular problem they are facing. And that's a virtuous circle. So what will be very important is to not prevent such actions, but even more to encourage this behavior through a system. And there is one very important thing about encouraging trials. It's to authorize failure. Okay, allowing people to fail means that you let them try and see for themselves what works and what does not. And again, as before, it's not a call to anarchy. As a leader, you create the conditions in which it's safe to fail. In some situations, some days, failure is not authorized. If you have a meeting with a prospective venture capitalist and you are running the life of your company on it, that's not a time to run an experiment. But in your next meeting between sales and engineering, well, maybe the stakes are not very high there and you can try some things. So at Pix4D, for example, we prefer to allow small bugs to get all the way to production rather than putting complicated process that would decrease our time to market and decrease our creativity. And we were fine with that. We accepted this kind of risk. But at Retinai, I was working on a medical device. And this was obviously not the same story. We were not allowed to fail in production. But we put ways to run experiments and see them fail in another environment. Again, experience and context. This is key. Okay, so I'll repeat myself again. Letting people act and fail does not mean it's the anarchy. There are two things you put in place around that, and you can think of them as controls, but they are so different from the process kind of controls that you might be familiar with that I don't like to call them that. It's more of a light framework. So the first part of the framework is alignment. You want your team to work towards a common goal inside a common context. If you want any team members to take decisions, and if you want those decisions to be well informed, well, you have to give them information. There is no shortcut or magic trick there. It's just about communicating. That requires an effort in building the message, in getting clarity, in adding context, and simplifying. But you know what? It also means that it simply requires repetition. And I'm really, really not kidding. You just have to say it and say it and say it. And people tend to misunderstand because they superimpose their agenda on top of the message and many other things. But by repetition, correction, comment, you can achieve alignment. And you might have heard that I have repeated myself already quite a bit today. And that's on purpose, if you were wondering. So if you don't believe that repetition is important, I'll let you do your own research on that one. There are plenty of resources to be read on the topic. Okay, the second control after alignment is accompaniment. Once you start empowering your employees and you give them more liberty, you let them act, you let them fail, but you should not abandon them to figure it out on their own. So like I mentioned earlier, most people are not ready. And that's your second big responsibility as a leader. Now that you have removed the shackles from your team, you have to help them find a way. And notice how I phrased it. I said help them find a way. I did not say show them the way. It's an important distinction. So there are many tools and practices at your disposal to help your people grow. And I'll mention a few now. And I'm going to start by giving you a secret. It's all about communication. We said that what's important is not the hardcore technical skills, the human or social skills. And you basically practice those through interactions. As a leader, your interactions with your team members are extremely important. So your first tool is feedback. As a leader, you have to become a master at giving and receiving feedback. It's important, both sides. People, you included, they have a lot of blind spots. Only through feedback can one discover what his or her weak spots are. And there is a way to give feedback. Radical Candor, for example, it's a book that I love on the subject, but there are many others. So I'll say a couple of things about giving feedback. First thing is that it needs to be on the spot. A feedback given days later is useless. All the context is lost. It's likely the person won't know what you're referring to. So what's the point? And I won't talk about the once in a year performance review. This meeting performance review is not a place to give feedback. At best, it's a summary of the feedback that has been given through the year. But, if your team member discovers anything at the time of the performance review, the year performance review, then you're not doing your job as a manager. The second thing about giving feedback is that it needs to be frank, clear, and non-threatening. No bullshit. And I'm not a really big fan of the shit sandwich, if you have ever heard that. Your goal is that the person in front of you improve a behavior. And so she needs to understand what you are saying and understand the context and the reason that make you say that. Very important. Okay, so that's about giving feedback. I'll say also a couple of things about receiving feedback. And this is something I try to repeat myself when I receive some. And this is something I often have to tell my teammates, especially when they get defensive. So the feedback first is it's not given as an attack. It's given as a way for you and for the team to improve. And even if it were given as an attack, no good comes from taking it as an attack. So you take it as something constructive, whatever the format in which it's given. And then if some feedback is given, and that's important, it means that someone has such an impression. Okay, if you are told that you are to X, whatever X is, it does not matter whether you agree or not. For some reason, some people perceive you like that. And so you have something to do. Either profound, it's really a problem you have to address, or maybe it's more on the surface, it's the way you communicate or the way you behave because you don't actually feel like that inside. Doesn't matter, right? There is something to be done. So that's about feedback. Once you give feedback and you receive feedback regularly, you want to help your employee deal with this feedback. And for that, I'll talk about two things. I'll talk about mentoring and coaching. So mentoring, it's about sharing your experience and your wisdom. You have already been confronted to the problem. You have solved it. You are in this leader position, most likely because you went through the step before. What did you do in that situation, right? The mentor is the role model. And as a leader, you are this role model to the members of your team. There are two things you do there. First, you lead by example. You demonstrate in your day-to-day behavior what you believe in, and you demonstrate what you ask them to do. You do it yourself. And second, you heavily communicate about techniques, organization, your general experience, all sorts of things. You push information. But there is another technique that I tend to find more useful, and it's coaching. So in coaching, you don't give solutions. Rather, you help the person travel his own path. So for example, you use questioning to force the person to analyze their problem deeper. You try to have an unbiased view and just help the person find his own conclusions. So I say it's more powerful because it is proven that we learn better when we go through the entire thinking process on our own rather than being handed the solution. However, coaching is harder. It requires more work from the coachee, who is actively seeking the solution, and it's also more difficult for the coach, who has to apply coaching skills and techniques, as opposed to the mentor who just gives his own view. If you're interested in coaching, there is a book called $1 Trillion Coach that came out in 2018, I think. It's about the late Bill Campbell, who was coaching a lot of the top brass in the Silicon Valley. For example, he was coaching the Google executive team all the way to the CEO and many, many others. And you know what? This guy knew very little about technology. He was a football coach. And there are many, many things in this book, but there are two interesting things for talking about coaching. Coaching is a skill, right, or a set of skills, and the coach does not need to know your job to be a coach. And everybody, that's the second thing, everybody, even Google CEO, even the president of the US, whatever, they have things to learn and work on, and they can benefit from coaching. So all these processes, feedback, mentoring, coaching, they are about personal communication geared toward growth. And this needs to happen regularly and frequently. So at Pix40, for example, I was spending 30 minutes per week with each of the individuals in my team. And I was actually doing that even with a few others that were not in my team and that had asked me to do this exercise with them. And you do need this time, face-to-face, for any actual benefit to take place. And I have found that it's well worth it because, again, it's about scale. Okay, it's not about you doing your work, it's about you helping the other people making more work or more productive work, and therefore multiplying your impact. So the book we see here in the picture, it's the companion book to Management 3.0 from the same author, and it includes many tools and practices for managing modern teams of creative people. I just wanted to mention it. I won't go more in detail, but there are hundreds of things inside this book. Okay, so I'm reaching the end. Not quite. Still a few minutes to bear with me. And before concluding, I'd like to do kind of a small practice case, to see a bit what this all might look like. So let's take an example. Say you have a star developer. And so he's a star developer, so you want him to grow and you want him to relieve you of some of your responsibilities that you have as the leader of the team. And doing that goes through interacting with non-tech people. So for example, let's say that you want him to run the stakeholder meeting where a representative of your team meets with the sales lead, the marketing lead, and the CTO, for example. Okay, but your developer is not polished in his interactions with others. He has no experience communicating, organizing. Sometimes the communication actually creates problems. You have seen that in the past. So you don't want him to feel like he's thrown at a table of monsters that are there to beat him up. But on the opposite side, you also don't want him to appear like the monster who is grumpy, who says no to everything, who has a short temper, whatever the thing might be. So what might the process of growing this person to that particular role and responsibility look like? So first, there is communication. You have to align on the objectives. You have to tell him why you want him to do that. What's your expectation? Maybe what's in it for him? And you also have maybe to tell that and mention that to the team because it might create jealousy or there might be questions and whatever. So it's all a communication exercise, always. Align with everybody. So then the next step, you might start with some shadowing. You bring this person to the meetings with the explicit understanding that he is not expected to participate. You are still representing your team in this meeting. What you can do afterwards is have conversations about those meetings. Okay, what were his reactions to what happened? Was he frustrated by something? Does he have questions? Things like that. Get feedback, get the communication rolling. Then you might start getting him included in the meeting preparation. So for example, to work on the message and the status to report, okay? Maybe you do that a few times, and each time you try to let him come up with more of the content, because this is actually the actual part, what is the message you want to bring and in which envelope? And maybe you move from setting the message to approving the message, right? He comes up with most of it. And so after a while, you might want to give him the lead while you still attend, but you take a backseat. And this is a dangerous moment. Before, you were working one-on-one with him. You were in a known environment where you had established openness and trust. But now this meeting, it might not be the same. There are more people. A failure will not feel the same. So you might want to set expectation. You with him of what he might expect, but also with the participants, right? You are trying to put him forward, so some things might not be as good as they used to be. And at that point, the best strategy, and it's very important, is to allow for failure, especially small ones. You should not jump in at the slightest occasion. Only come in if he really struggles, or maybe if the entire message is in jeopardy and you feel that you won't be able to fix it later. You also do not want to confront or give feedback during the meeting in this setting where there are more people with a less developed relationship with your teammate. You keep your feedback session for just after the meeting, where you will review what went good and what went bad and talk about it. And soon you will be able to entirely skip the meeting, possibly to not even have to review the message that is brought there. You have full confidence that this task is well taken care of. And so there has been a lot of accompaniment and a lot of growth, and you have acted as a leader. So to start the conclusion, I hope that you have felt that this is hard work. Everything that I mentioned today is not a default. Most people do not like to get outside their comfort zone. Most people will default into hiding behind their job description, their manager, whatever. But the important thing to remember is that it is not about laziness. It is about how the human psyche works. It is about perception. It is about bias. It is about a lot of those things. So Reed Hastings, what happened? Sorry. Reed Hastings, the CEO of Netflix, he co-authored a book that was published in September, last September, and it's called No Rules Rules. And this is about the Netflix culture and the management style. And I can talk hours about this book. I think it's a great book. But the most important lesson, especially for us today, is that it is work to create a culture of autonomy and combat the default behavior. I was getting very angry with a former CEO of mine who would always say, people are adults, they'll figure it out, and would take absolutely no action on any topic. And that's just not true. It just won't work on its own. You have to manage and lead the culture and the change in the environment. So, to finish my conclusion, almost, you start with trust. From there, you empower your team by giving them power, decision power, and removing processes and information barriers. You let them act, and you let them fail. And along the way, you build a framework that is about accompaniment and alignment. And that's very important. And this is core to Management 3.0. In our modern companies, with creative jobs, you do not manage the employee. You don't tell her what to do or how to do it. Rather, you manage the environment so that it is such that it is such an environment that she'll be able to do the best work she can inside this environment. And so I tried to talk about constructing from the ground up an autonomous team, but you also need to take care of it. The good news is that it's not more work. On the contrary, if you were able to create this autonomous team, there is some sort of virtual circle that will try to sustain itself because it feels better. So people want to stay into this kind of environment, in my experience at least. But the bad news is that it's still work, and that those control, the slide framework, the accompaniment, the alignment, the entire communication, it needs to be exercised constantly. There are a lot more things to be said, but I hope I gave you a number of ideas and pointers. I gave you an extensive list of books to read, and I have more if you want. And again, to conclude, last word, this is work, but this is your work as a leader. And that's it for me today. We don't have beers to share, but you might have a beer on your side. I encourage you to get in touch with me if you have questions, if you want to give me feedback. I love getting feedback. That's, I guess, a bit the point also. And maybe we can have a discussion, maybe try to mingle a bit in Gather if you have some time. And thank you.